the early Egypt, which goes back at least to 3500 BC, maybe earlier. It may very well rival the oldest civilization we know about, which is the Sumerians. From 3500 to say 2500 BC, about 1,000 years. And then the Middle Kingdom goes from about 2500 BC to about 1700, 1750 BC, okay? It's thought that he came to Egypt during the reign of Sesostris II, somewhere about around 1900 BC. And shortly prior to this time, Upper and Lower Egypt had been unified under one ruler, and now Egyptian influence expanded south and east. Couple interesting facts. The Nile River is the longest river in the world without a tributary. It runs for 1,500 miles. And then it breaks into 3 branches. But anyway, before it empties into the Mediterranean. Most of the rivers in the world flow in which direction? South. Nile flows north. And it's the Nile that saved basically Egypt. And when they talk about Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, you would think by looking at a map, and somewhere I've got one, there we go. You would think that, and I don't know if this pointer works or not. Nope. You would think Upper Egypt is up toward the Mediterranean Sea, the Great Sea, and Lower Egypt is down there. No. This is Upper Egypt down here and here. Here are your major cities. Memphis was its original capital. That's where Memphis, Tennessee got named from. City of On, you remember Joseph was given a wife by Pharaoh. Who was she? Anybody remember? She was the daughter of who? She was the daughter of the priest of On, which we now call Heliopolis. This is Goshen. How many people have seen, what's that guy's name on the TVs all the time? My Pillow? What's his name? Yeah. He talks about the cotton, and it comes, if you've seen the map, it comes from here, this area right here, in between the 2 branches of the Nile, okay? So Mike Lindell is his name. Yeah, okay, all right. And also, just for information, follow the red line, and that's the Exodus path they took, and we'll look at that in more detail later. But anyway, Joseph made Pharaoh the richest man in the world. He has all the money, has all the cattle, has all the land except for the priest's land, and he has all the people. They're his slaves to begin with. It's interesting that during the time Joseph was there, it's most likely that Egypt was being ruled by foreign kings. And what does anybody know? Here's something, sidebar. What does the word Pharaoh mean? The great house. And so his house was all of Egypt, okay? Now then, in about 570 BC, the Persians overtake Egypt, Cyrus the Great. And then you have the rise of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy, that ruled Egypt. Who was the last ruler of Egypt before the Romans took over? Anybody remember? No. It was a woman, Cleopatra. She had an affair with a guy named, anybody remember? Mark Antony. Who was he? Roman general. They fought several times, and finally the decisive battle was in 31 BC, the Battle of Actium. Who was the Roman general that opposed him? Anybody remember? Octavian. 31 BC. In 27 BC, 4 years later, the Roman Senate made him the first emperor. He changed his name to Caesar Augustus. He's mentioned in the Bible. You remember that? Tiberius follows him. He reigns from 27 BC to 14 AD. He dies, and then Tiberius takes over. Tiberius is mentioned. And then I think there's about 4 or 5 of the original first kings, emperors of Rome that are mentioned. But after the defeat of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, you remember, he got killed. She was going to be made a spectacle of. They were going to put her in a cage and, ride her through Rome. She has an asp snake bite her. And the snake died. No, not really. She dies, and then the Romans have it all. They rule after that. That's just some interesting sidelight. But what was Joseph's family's occupation? They were shepherds. Look at something. Turn over to Genesis 40. Let's see. Let me see where I was looking at. Look at Genesis 46. This is another indication that Pharaoh was not a native Egyptian. What was the lowest class occupation in all of Egypt? Read the last verse of Genesis 46. I think it's verse 34. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, this is Joseph talking to his family, what is your occupation? Here's how you should answer. Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen. Goshen is, see it right here, fertile, right near the head of the Suez area. And at that time, you had the Sinai Peninsula around here. Now, you've got something called the Suez Canal that connects the Gulf of Suez to the Mediterranean Sea. But they live in Goshen. It's a delta. It has water usually from the heavy mid-African rains around the last of June every year. It gets to about 35 feet above flood stage. And it floods that area around Goshen to about 4 feet, becomes a swamp or a bog. And that's perfect for raising sheep and cattle and what have you. So Pharaoh lets them live in the land of Goshen. Okay. The land of Egypt is about 500,000 square miles in total. Only less than 5% of that is suitable for year-round habitation, and less than that for cultivation of crops. So anyway, let's go back to where we were. Here's some extra biblical evidence I found about Joseph. Turned up, they had some artifacts, what they thought were trinkets, in the Museum of Egypt over in Cairo. And somebody pulled them out and got to looking, and lo and behold, here's what they found. They found some coins with the image of biblical Joseph. The coins, like I said, were found in the Museum of Egypt in a pile of small artifacts. It had been thought that they were only charms or ornaments. The coins are said to bear Joseph's 2 names, the name that Pharaoh gave him and his Hebrew name. And here's another interesting fact. Some of those coins have an image of a cow on them, possibly alluding to Pharaoh's dream of 7 fat cows who were being devoured by 7 lean cows. They had it for hundreds of years and nobody thought they were worth anything. And somebody said, wait a minute, look what we got here. All right, so there we go. Now then, Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt before he dies at the age of 137 or 147. And then Joseph dies at the age of 110. And look at chapter 50, last chapter of Genesis. Verse 24 through 26. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Joseph made the sons, that's all of them, the sons of Israel, that'd be 11 of them, swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. He made him swear an oath. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. Here's an interesting thing about the Egyptians. They had multiple gods, but they did not worship idols. They thought that cattle, sheep, goats were representatives of the gods. Their chief god was Ra, R-A. And they had, just a sidebar, Set was the god of evil. He was their equivalent of our Satan, or the devil. But they never worshiped idols per se. They had temples, ornate temples, but they never had bowed down to idols. I thought that was interesting. So, but interesting, let me go back. We're getting into Exodus now, and the word Exodus means to leave or get out, okay? Now then, how many people have thought about what all we see happening for the first time in the book of Genesis? What does Genesis mean? Beginning. There's 17 things that we find that got started in Genesis. Obviously, the universe. Remember that? Remember in the book of Job, God appears to Job, and his first question, Job, what did he ask him? Where were you when I created the universe? He didn't have an answer. Some people say God can't be sarcastic. You need to read the book of Job, okay? We see order and complexity. We see the solar system. We see the atmosphere and the hydrosphere. I was reading today about the Russians hold the record for the deepest hole ever drilled, 40,000 feet deep. The temperature down there is 356 degrees Fahrenheit, and rock becomes like plastic. And they finally had to abandon it at about 44,000 feet. That's nearly 9 miles down. They found fossils and something else. Water vapor, tons of it. And do you remember when the flood happened? What did Moses say happened? Go back to Genesis. Chapter 8. Let's see where it is. Chapter 7. Chapter 7:11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day, all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Where did all the water come from? Atmosphere, rain. But what did it say? The floodgates of what? Huh? Yeah. That's where all this water came from. And it just astounded these scientists doing this deep well, okay? And that's free. I didn't charge you for that. Okay, so we see life created, all kinds of life, insects, animals, fish, birds. Man is made, woman is made. You know, you've heard the story. He brought all the animals in front of Adam and he named them. Whatever he named them, that's what they were called. But there was no suitable helpmeet found for Adam. So God says, Adam, I'm going to make you somebody that'll be your helpmeet. And she's going to cook and she's going to be beautiful. And he says, what's that going to cost me? He said, she'll always agree with you. You'll never have an argument with her. She'll do everything you ask. And she'll even anticipate what you need and fulfill it before you ask. Adam says, well, what's that going to cost me? He says, well, I'm afraid it's going to cost an arm and a leg. Adam says, what could I get for a rib? I'll hear the end of this later. But anyway, that's what we see there. Language, that's where languages were created. Government, culture, nations, religion, the chosen people, the beginning of redemption, and the beginning of prophecy. It's all right there in those 50 pages. So now, he made them swear an oath that when he died, that they would take his bones. Now, the Egyptians believed in the resurrection. That's why they embalmed people. They didn't know how it would happen, but they wanted to do their best to keep the body from decaying because they felt that sometime in the future, the soul, the spirit, would be restored to the body. That's why they embalm. That's why we have mummies today, okay? They also believed in a final judgment, that at one time people are going to be called to give an account for everything they've done, either good or bad. You know, they were not stupid. They built the pyramids. In fact, the Great Pyramid of Giza is the last of the ancient 7 wonders of the world that still exists, you know. Alexandria, up there, I got it off the map, was the second biggest metropolis on the planet behind Rome. They were, you know, in one of the 7 ancient wonders, the lighthouse they had there at Alexandria is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Okay, so now then there is a break from Genesis 50 to Exodus 1, somewhere close to 400 years. Remember what God had told Abraham? That his descendants were going to be as numerous as what? As the stars or the sand on the seashore. And then he told him something else. What else did he tell him? Go back to Genesis 15. I think that's right. Yeah, Genesis 15. Verse 9, or verse 8. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it, of this land? Verse 9, so God said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. How many years? 400 years. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. So he was told they're going to be there for about 400 years. We're going to find out it's 430 years. Okay, so now I want you to notice something else. Exodus 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family, and he names them all, 70 or 75. Now then, a new king. Verse 8, that word now in the Hebrew is and. It's a continuation. In fact, the first 7 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges, begin with and, or a word in the Hebrew that means that. Same thing. Like Exodus is a continuation, the second chapter of what's going on. Okay? So, they have now gone from 70 or 75 to a couple million people. And this new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. Pharaoh doesn't realize it, but you know what he's doing? He's got them on an exercise program, getting them in shape so they can survive traveling hundreds of miles in the desert, unbeknownst to him. They made their lives bitter with hard work in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their hard labor, the Egyptians used them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you help the Hebrew women in childbirth and observe them on the delivery stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? The midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive. So God was kind to the midwives and to the people, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. So the place is just multiplying. About estimates are 2 million. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now then, chapter 2. Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. What's her name? What's Moses' mother's name? Jochebed. Who's his daddy? Amram. How do we know that? It's not in Hebrew. It's not in the 2nd chapter. Where is it? Somebody turn over and read Exodus 6, verse 20, I think it is. They're both Levites, and it's going to be interesting. Amram married Jochebed. Who was she? Was she related to him? What does it say in 6:20? Yeah. He married his aunt. You got it? It was his father's sister. He married his aunt. Okay? And this is just something that came to mind. Years ago, probably 30, Miss Jim Bob. How many people remember Miss Jim Bob? She was, and I used to give out a research question before the class ended. And one Sunday I said, next Sunday I want you to tell me the names of Moses' mom and daddy. Her hand went straight up and she looked at me and she was sitting right there, said Amram and Jochebed. And she says, you didn't figure I'd know that, did you? I said, I couldn't let this one go. I said, yeah, I knew you would know it. And she says, how did you know I'd know it? I said, because you were Moses' midwife. And then she did this, and she says, young man, you better respect your elders. And I still think about that every time I read this. All right. So that's where we are right now. They, she kept the child. He was, and we can look at Hebrews 11. But out of faith, she put the child in the Nile. But she put a boat under him. She made a thing of reeds and put pitch and tar in it and wrapped him in clothes and put him in the Nile, in the reeds. Then Pharaoh's daughter, verse 5 of chapter 2, went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. How did she know that? Because of the clothing he was wrapped in. Okay? So, his sister, his older sister Miriam, is standing looking to see what happens. So then Miriam asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She adopted him. She named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. So he's killing all these babies. And the one that's going to bring all of Israel out of Egypt is his grandson. God's going to get what God wants. He cannot lose. So, and then we can look at Moses' life in 3 spans, each 40 years. He was 40 years in Egypt, and Stephen in his speech in Acts 7 said he was educated in all the things that the Egyptians knew. He's 40 years old when he finds an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite, and he kills him, thinking that, well, then now they'll respect me and follow me. And he buried him. And then a few days later, 2 Israelites are going at it, and he stops them. He says, what are you going to do? You going to kill us like you did the Egyptian? He's 40 years old, so he flees. He goes to Mount Sinai, which is in Midian. And he stays there for 40 years. And he's 80 years old. When he's out tending to Jethro, his father-in-law's sheep, and he sees a bush burning, but it doesn't burn up. He said, that's unusual. I'll walk over there and take a look at that. And then God says, stop. God spoke to him from the bush, or the angel of the Lord, and said, don't come any closer. Take your shoes off, because where you're standing is holy ground. And then we'll get into this. We're about out of time. We'll get into that next week. So from 80 to 120, he's leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And the Bible's going to tell us that when he's 120 years old and he dies, he still has the eyesight and the strength of a 40-year-old man. Imagine that. He did not age. Their shoes didn't wear out. Their sandals didn't wear out when they were on the journey. There's a whole lot of stuff in here that we're going to look at. Now then, what did Joseph make them promise? Swore an oath that they would do what when they left? Huh? Look at Exodus 13, verse 19. What does it say? And we'll end with this.
Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, carry up my bones away hence with you.
Moses himself carried his bones over 400 years later. All right. It's great to have Lee back. You don't want to repeat last week, do you? Okay, good. But you got a good report. That's good. Okay. Kathy, how's Sean? He's what, 32? 31? He's where, MD Anderson? Okay. All right. How are you doing? Good. Good. I haven't heard an update on Jess Whiteside. Is anybody? I'm assuming no news is good news. Okay.